Hey there, today we're taking a look at The Evil Within 2 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U, and this is running on the TRIGKEY Ryzen 5 5500U mini PC that we took a look at before, which is configured to run at 25 watts, but you'll see that we won't even be hitting that because we're hitting the maximum clock speed of the iGPU, which is the limiting factor here. The game itself is going to be running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you do need to go into the advanced settings and manually set everything to disabled, because at the lowest graphics preset, it will still enable things just at their lowest quality. But once you've done this, the level of performance that we get at 1080p is going to be pretty abysmal. We're not really even going to be able to hit a 30 FPS average, though it is consistently in the mid-20s most of the time. It's not going to be a pleasant experience. And in general, trying to play like this is really going to be a very brutal experience. And already we're very aggressive with the graphics settings that we're using here. So for the most part, playing this in 1080p is going to be out of the question. We can, of course, drop the resolution, and that is going to be what is necessary to get a actually decent frame rate out of this. Unfortunately, dropping down to 900p really doesn't do us much of a favor here, though we are now hitting an above 30 FPS average for most of the experience in the game, and this is a very cutscene heavy game. You're still going to find dips below that 30 FPS average with the 1% lows, and overall the experience of trying to play like this was just not really that consistent. It was decent enough, but it really is not that pleasant of an experience. You're already sacrificing so much in terms of visual quality because you have to drop all of the graphic settings down pretty aggressively. Now we're also dropping the resolution, and we're barely able to get a decent frame rate. If 30 FPS is perfectly fine with you, you can certainly get away with it here, but it's not going to be something that I would think is that remarkable. Really, it wasn't until I dropped things down to 720p that we actually started to get a really nice FPS, and it became a far more playable experience. This is a title that you're really interested in playing. You're going to have to go with 720p on this specific chip. And one thing that I do have to note is that the Ryzen 5 5500U, depending on the system that you get, is not going to be the same. We are using 16 gigabytes of RAM on the system in dual channel running at 3200 megahertz. Now that in and of itself is going to mean that if you're on an 8 gigabyte system, you're going to have a overall different experience if you're on a system that has a lower TDP. So you do need to check at what wattage your chip is set to run at. This one out of the box was set to 25 watts, and that is going to give you pretty much most of the performance that you're going to be able to get out of this chip. As you can see, most of the time we're not even hitting anywhere near that 25 watts. The reason being is, of course, because the GPU clock is reaching its maximum 1800 watts, and that's the limiting factor here. We could use more of that wattage for the CPU, but the system itself actually doesn't need it, so it's not really using it. But overall, that is the biggest indicator in terms of performance. It's just going to be that iGPU, and unfortunately it's not really powerful enough to get us a decent result at a higher resolution, so 720p is the way to go. Now, another thing that I do have to note is that depending on the system that you have in particular, the performance could be pretty different. The laptop that I have that rocks the Ryzen 5 5500U stock comes at 15 watts, but if I use a tool to raise that TDP up to 25 watts, it still performs noticeably worse than this specific system. So this is really one of the most ideal scenarios, and that should let you know that the level of performance that you're going to get out of this is going to be a little rough unless you have the most ideal system with the Ryzen 5 5500U. Another thing to note is that while I'm playing the game at 720p, I was having this problem where the game itself would just never full screen. So I was actually essentially playing it in borderless Windows mode, and let me show you exactly what that actually looked like for me. As you can see, it's not exactly the most pleasant experience to try to play a game like this. And yes, I tried going into the settings to full screen it. It would essentially just flicker and go back to just being borderless windowed mode, and hitting Alt Enter would not let me full screen in any way. This was pretty much the only way that I could actually get the game to play. We certainly got a good FPS out of this, but it wasn't exactly a great experience because of the fact that it was windowed like this. If your system actually lets you full screen it, then it's going to be a fantastic experience, but outside of that, you're going to have a pretty rough time. So if you could certainly get it to work, then it is going to give you a great time at 720p, but you do have to be pretty aggressive with the graphics settings. Overall, the game still looks decent. I think its art style lends itself pretty well to just being able to lower the resolution and also lower the in-game settings, and you still get a nice visual design. But it's certainly something that you need to take into account. But I'll catch you in the next one.